I don't think we got all that far in covering all the different issues in Catholic social teaching. If I'm recalling correctly, we spent a good bit of time last time talking about issues with money and the economy and social justice, and maybe thinking a little about work and all of those things. So that's important stuff to cover. There's a whole lot else in Catholic social teaching that we could cover. And so really I just kind of wanted to use today to kind of focus on the issues that you all would have the most interest in tackling at this point. Since this is going to be kind of our last, I want you to keep your money's worth and get an opportunity to deal with the issues that might be most useful for you. So kind of just to get our brains recalling kind of what we've done. At one point we ran through kind of the basic principles of Catholic social teaching that are going to kind of apply to all the different particular issues we look at. So we're going to build up Catholic social teaching, kind of to refresh our memories. What are kind of the basic principles? Anybody recall some of those, or have in your notes maybe some of those principles for us to refresh our memory?
Common good.
Yeah, so the common good. Wow, that is really squeaky. Okay. Common good.
Human dignity.
So, right, and all of it is going to come out of that fundamental principle of Catholic ethics, right? Going all the way back to the fall, where we're doing the basics of Catholic ethics, right? It is all rooted in this idea of the intrinsic dignity of the human person, right? That we can't ever intentionally violate. So then Catholic social teaching is asking, okay, if we have that basic belief, then how are we going to act kind of on the bigger social scale in order to honor that dignity of all different human persons affected by these things. So we're going to pursue the common good, right? So that means when we are acting, when we are part of social systems, we need to act in a way that's not going to promote our individual good, right? But that it's going to contribute to kind of a shared common good. What else?
Greater good versus common good. Following the golden rule.
Yeah, so that, I mean, following the golden rule would be a kind of way of thinking about how you act for the common good. Follows from human dignity.
You also had, I forgot how you termed it, but you don't want to intentionally harm.
Right.
If you do, the intention should not be to harm someone.
Yeah, so one of the other things to keep in mind when we're doing Catholic ethics, right, is that the thing we call the principle of double effect, which means that sometimes there are going to be actions that have the unintended effect of harming an innocent person, right? And so that doesn't mean that every action like that is immoral, right? Because sometimes there's no way to avoid an unintended harm to somebody, right? And so principle of double effect is a way of thinking through those sorts of complex situations where you have a good effect you're aiming for, but also you anticipate some bad effects that are going to come from that. And we use that in Catholic social thought as well. Right? So if you're going to pass like an economic policy that's aimed at benefiting a particular group, it might have the unintended effect of harming something else. Right? That doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. Sometimes times you have to aim for the best outcome possible. So another principle, right, is principle of community, right, that we are by nature social beings, and we ought to work to form strong communities, strong connections with the people around us. Right, what do we call it when we are, so community is typically like the people we are in contact with. What do we call the principle where we try to recognize the dignity of people very different from us or very far from us?
Solidarity.
Yeah, right, so solidarity is kind of a complement to that. Solidarity means that when I am making choices, when I vote, when I shop, when I invest in a company, that I am going to think about being in solidarity with people maybe very far away who are going to be affected by those actions, right? So solidarity would lead us to think about, gee, these sneakers are a lot cheaper than these other sneakers. Why is that, right? What is the life like of the person who made these sneakers in Bangladesh or wherever it might be, right? So trying to think about recognizing that dignity of those people. Good.
Subsidiarity, is that the same as community?
Nope. So subsidiarity.
Subsidiarity, sorry.
This is the hardest one to say. Subsidiarity. So subsidiarity, right, is the principle that says we ought to do things on the most local, personal level possible, right? So that if you can accomplish something in a city as opposed to the state, it's better to do it in the city. If you can do it on the state level as opposed to the national level, it's better to do it on the state, right? So the idea, this doesn't mean, of course, that you can't have national or even international organizations. Why is this a principle of Catholic social teaching, right? Because it sounds like maybe this is just, kind of Rush Limbaugh managed to sneak into the bishop's meeting and like sneak in some ideas there about the bad federal government.
Human dignity, you ought to solve as many of your own problems as you can rather than somebody.
Right, well, and that kind of ties in, I think that's part of it. That also comes up in one of these other principles, principle of participation, right? So that people who are affected by systems, by decisions, ought to have a voice in them, right? So if you're running a big corporation, for example, right, when you're trying to decide on the policies for the employees, participation would say those employees, as much as is possible, should have a voice in those policies. Or when you're a government, right, this also comes up a lot in sort of international relations, right? Do we go into a country and tell them, we know what's best for you, we're going to set things up, or do you allow them to participate in shaping their own lives and decisions? So that's part of it. Why else would subsidiarity be?
It helps build and connect the community in general. Because
Yeah.
you do business with somebody in the community, you do business with somebody else in the community, you get ties together, it grows the community closer together. Similar as in a parish. People do things for each other in the parish, do things for the parish as a whole, and it's a stronger community that way.
Yeah, right. It's about you can have relationships with people, right? And so subsidiarity says, where are real relationships going to happen? Where are we more likely to treat somebody as a person as opposed to a statistic, right? It's going to be on the small, personal, local level, right? So presumably most of us know our pastor better than we know Bishop Kemmy, right? You need a bishop. You need somebody who brings the area's churches together to cooperate, but you're not going to, almost by definition, most people aren't going to know the bishop as well as they're going to know their pastor. It's just because on that scale, it's hard for Bishop Kemi to know every Catholic in the diocese. Especially when some of our parishes are so big, it'd be hard for the pastor to even know everybody in that parish. And that's why this is a principle, right? Because it's all about treating people as having that dignity, or treating people as an end in themselves and not just a means that you have towards some goal.
You said that this could be applied internationally.
Mm-hmm.
How can this be applied to Venezuela? Why is it that it seems that, no, okay, in the past, it looks like every country in the world looks up at the United States for help. Why is it that, look at all the suffering, not only Venezuela, but the countries around. Colombia one, has
Right.
millions of Venezuela. And nobody does anything. The way I see it, very within myopia, Russia and China are behind the United States with Venezuela in the middle.
Yeah, I mean,
In here
it's
they say we can resort to military this and that, I don't know, it's what they say, I repeat. But how can we, why is it that nobody's helping? The reason is there, the suffering is
Right.
there, the anguish is there, they are Catholic, they must be a little bit of everything. But why? I see like an international inertia.
yeah, it's complicated, right? Trying to figure out how to apply these principles to specific situations like that. So we can, right, so solidarity would say that we can't just say, oh, well, that's thousands of miles away, that's not our problem. We do need to be concerned about people who are suffering, even if they're far away. Figuring out the best way to help is a challenge. So and one of the possibilities we could talk about would be kind of just war theory in terms of how do you think as a Catholic about possibilities of military action in the world. So we could talk about that. Or maybe you do softer interventions of an economic or diplomatic approach. Yeah, it's a tough question. One of the challenges of Catholic social teaching is that it gives us principles to use, but in terms of how to specifically respond to concrete situations, it leaves a lot of that up to lay people who are involved, right? We have to exercise prudence to understand how can we act in the real world in the best way to live out these principles. And that's where a lot of the debate happens, right? So Catholic social teaching would say we have to care, we ought to put the well-being of those people ahead of our economic interests or ahead of maybe our political ideology or whatever it might be. But, right, the US bishops aren't necessarily going to formulate, well, here's the plan for how to deal with Venezuela. Sometimes they come out with recommendations on issues. Sometimes, though, that's something the experts have to deal with, and it's just giving the principles. But we can maybe come back to that. Let's see, we got a couple other principles left, right? So
Stewardship.
one would be stewardship, which ties in with some of the big issues we're facing today, right? So stewardship, this is not about your ties in the Wichita Diocese. Well, it's related. This is about care for the natural world in particular, and care for the environment, right? That we have an obligation to be good stewards of the world God has given us. And then the last one,
Preferential option for poor.
yeah, so preferential option for the poor. right? So this means that when we are making complicated policy decisions or economic choices, we ought to act in a way where, you know, if this is going to have multiple possible outcomes, we ought to prefer the one that is going to benefit the poor directly, right? Now, this is not because poor people are necessarily holier or something, right? This is in part just recognizing the way the world works, namely that the rich and powerful tend to take care of themselves, right? So if you are coming up with some policy, the people who are going to be the least likely to have their interests included in it are going to be the poor and the marginalized.
I'd go farther, I'd go preferential options for the poor, the incarcerated, the addicted,
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of times,
the mentally ill.
we'll talk about the marginalized instead of just the poor, right? So, I mean, most of those groups are going to also be poor, but yeah, the idea is to choose options that are going to benefit people who are not as able to make their own voices heard. The people who don't have the participation, right? So undocumented immigrants, or yeah, the incarcerated, or minorities, all those kinds of groups.
I could go on.
Yeah. So are there any questions? Any? Does this ring bells, hopefully? Okay. So those are kind of the principles that are going to guide the church's response to all of these big complex issues we are facing in our world today.
Would the Catholic Church consider paying taxes a form of stewardship?
It can be. I mean, paying taxes could be involved in lots of, right, a lot of these principles would tie into.
I always wondered about that, because we all pay taxes, and I'm just wondering what the church's stance on this.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea of taxes is that this is our, I mean, in theory, right, this is the way our community supports itself, cares for the poor, does a lot of those kinds of things. Our taxes go into stopping bad guys through the military and police. It goes into care for the environment. It goes into care for the poor through all kinds of social programs. And so it would tie in with many of these. Of course, we also sometimes end up talking about principle of double effect, right? So that I'm giving my tax money for all of these good reasons. Obviously, I think wherever you are on the political spectrum, you're going to think that some of the things our tax money is used for are going to be morally problematic or non-helpful. So sometimes you have to think about that too.
I think of the example of Archbishop Munchausen in Seattle. Seattle's housed the Trident submarine in the Puget Sound, which housed the nuclear bomb. If they had all go off, they destroy him. He refused to pay any of his money that was going to the military. He didn't make much of the bishop. It was just more of a symbolic act.
All right.
Is he right or wrong?
Oh, I mean, that's above my pay grade.
He was disobeying the law.
I mean, there can be, so illegal and immoral aren't necessarily the same thing, right? So there can be cases where what is legal is immoral, and what's moral is illegal, right? So like obviously as Catholics we would think that with abortion or euthanasia, but there can certainly be other cases where that comes up. Obviously this comes up a lot in our current political discourse in regard to immigration, right? Whether legality and morality are the same thing. There's also, and it comes up all kinds of issues. So this, I kind of wanted to get us thinking again. And my watch has apparently almost stopped, so I should look at that one, because it's not only 2:17. So there's a lot of different issues that we could look at. So I thought as a practice in participation, we could be a little democratic about this. So in terms of thinking about the kinds of topics we could talk about, probably can't get through all of them, but the ones that come immediately to mind, right? So just war falls under Catholic social teaching. There is concern about the environment, falls within this. There is, right, the large issue currently of immigration that we can look at. There is a lot of discussion in terms of Catholic social teaching in regard to healthcare and providing healthcare. Let's see, there is some of you may have noticed that Pope Francis recently called for the changing of the statements regarding capital punishment in the Catechism just a couple of months ago. So capital punishment falls into Catholic social teaching. Let's see, am I forgetting anything? Great big issues. Are there other big issues that stand out to people that we're not getting at here? Oh, I know. So, well, we talked about that. So.
How about the union between two men, being court married, doesn't put in there?
Yeah, that falls more under sexual ethics. So we talked about that a little in the fall, I think.
Politicians that don't follow their Catholic faith.
Yeah. What do we do about politicians? Politicians are a Catholic social teaching issue. So what I would say, we can't talk about all of this. Again, just to remind you all, and it's interesting, I teach in a graduate program in theology, and every year when we get to this course and I tell students, hey, we're going to use the Compendium of Social Doctrine of the Catholic Church, maybe one of all the students in a particular class will have ever heard of this thing before, which I find very interesting. But if you are interested in these issues, this is a really good source to look at, right? So it is also available in an actual book form, lots of places, so you can get it that way or you can get it online. But again, I don't have any illusions that you're going to remember everything we've talked about in these sessions months from now. But you might remember that there is this compendium out there, which can be a very useful place to go and look, because it deals with a lot of these issues. The economy, work, the environment, war, all of those kinds of issues show up here. So I'd encourage you, if you've never looked at it, to take a look at that. The other place I would encourage you to go, if you have some issue come up, and are kind of curious, well, what does the church say about this? If you just go to the UFCCB website and go to like issues and action or beliefs and teaching, there are pages for just about all of these issues, right? So the bishops have written a lot about immigration, a lot about just war, a lot about the environment. So that is a very good resource for people if you're trying to figure out what does the church say about some issue. And for my own little plug, I think there are a lot of Catholic groups out there who will present, their take on what the Catholic teaching about something is. Some of those are very helpful, but I think going to what the actual U.S. bishops have to say is where I would recommend you go first, right? So a lot of those other things are helpful, but they don't necessarily represent kind of the teaching authority of the church the same way as the U.S. bishops do.
And the Catechism has a little section on it.
Yeah, and the Catechism, and that compendium, while it's not exactly the same as the Catechism, it's basically made up entirely of selections from encyclicals, from other kind of papal documents, or from things put out by the USCCB, so it is also going to be a pretty good resource for the church's teaching. So I'd encourage you, if you 6 months from now somebody asks you, you know, man, what is this deal about immigration? You're not probably going to remember what I said, but maybe you're going to remember to go to these sources because they're helpful. So, given that we can't cover everything, do we have some preferences in regard to what you all want to start with, and we'll see what we can get through?
I'm probably the only one, but my emphasis is on healthcare.
Okay, so I got to vote for healthcare. Any other particular topics of interest? We
The
probably-
politicians.
What to do about those politicians? Yeah, although that one's
They go promising and promising and promising. As soon as they go there, they turn the table. And they don't feel ashamed.
yeah.
Tell
Okay, well, we can start by talking about healthcare, and we'll see how things progress from there, what other things we can tackle.
Certainly the Republicans couldn't solve it.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of thinking about, I think we could probably turn this thing off so it's not shining in my eye. Yeah, there we go. All right. Okay. So, what would you see as the big challenge for Catholics when it comes to healthcare?
I would say probably lack of health care is a form of euthanasia.
Okay. That's not like a loaded way of putting it, right? So, when we're talking about healthcare, right, there is the issue of coverage or
Accessibility.
access to healthcare is a big issue. Okay, what other issues do we have to grapple with, or what complicates the discussion as Catholics?
Accessibility is the whole issue.
Well, I mean, it's a big part of the issue.
Affordability.
That,
Affordability.
Cost.
That's big.
Yeah. So there's the cost.
That makes it accessible at the cost.
Yeah. Now, if we are talking about this and talking about access to healthcare, affordability of healthcare, right? In our present situation, this often gets complicated in Catholic circles, in particular. Why or how?
Because of abortion.
Contraception?
Yeah, right. So that there is, there are these kind of the moral issues or issues of, pen is dying, issues of conscience, right, tied into healthcare, right? So obviously, a lot of this debate in the recent years has centered on the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, right? And that has been the focus of a lot of the discussion. So if you go on online and Google Catholic healthcare access, right, you're going to get a whole lot of pages where people are arguing about whether or not Catholics ought to support the Affordable Care Act, or if they ought to advocate for its repeal, right? So that's going to be, it's going to show up in a lot of places.
The problem with the ACA, you get different issues involved. You get moral issues and you get accessibility issues. Now, as Catholics, we can't support, that all the money, say, goes to abortion and makes Catholic hospitals good and this sort of thing. But there's another issue of accessibility that we can support. I know people that for the first time in their lives could buy health insurance because of the ACA. a retired person, 60, 65. It forces everybody to pay for everybody. Those who are, what do you call it, when they have previous health issues.
Yeah, pre-existing
Existing
conditions.
conditions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's parts of it you support, and parts of it we can't support, right?
Yeah, so one of the other issues that gets brought up that you mentioned, right, is just the personal mandate, right, that everybody has to either purchase health insurance or pay a penalty.
But that was done away with.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but there are a lot of people who would
Reinstate that.
like to see that as part of it, right? So that was part of the debate. And some people would argue some of the problems with it as it currently operates is because if you get rid of this, it makes the program less sustainable, right? So, yeah, I mean, a lot of people argue. So the real kind of way it breaks down is, right, we would say, well, there's good that comes from this from a Catholic perspective, right, in regards to increase in access to health care, right, that it's going to allow more people to have health coverage than people had in the past. The bad from particularly Catholic view is with particularly around the issues of abortion and contraception, right, that it mandated coverage of these things, right, and indirectly it's going to require people to fund them via being part of these insurance systems, right?
Fuel care in there too.
Yeah, so that, I mean, there are a lot of other related issues, right? We could talk about, medical care for transgender cases, and there's a lot of these moral.
It's gave everybody the easy way out when it comes to end of life decisions. Euthanasia, basically.
Yeah, although that's not,
Oregon.
it's not
Yeah.
it's not tied into.
It's in
I
some
think
states
it's the
it's tied
hidden
in.
part of ACA.
Yeah.
It's very down in there, I believe.
Yeah, I've not seen that.
It's allowed states to pass laws on euthanasia.
But I didn't hear.
Yeah, the states were passing laws on euthanasia, I think prior to
But it made it easier.
Affordable Care Act.
But it's not mandated.
But
So,
do you think it would fall into the category of where you've got selective care by the insurance and the doctors because of the pressure from ACA, of the viability, or if you're worthy of being treated, you're 80 years old, but that kind of thing? Do you feel like that has kind of been looped into that?
I would say, I would call that kind of a limitation of the care you get based on the age of the factors.
Yeah.
Would that be a better way of describing it?
Sure.
although, again, so this argument comes up a lot. The death panels thing that floated around Facebook was not actually part of the Affordable Care Act.
It was supposed to go into effect in 2015, they never did.
But all of that is, those are important issues. Of course, what we have to recall is that it's not as if prior to the Affordable Care Act, everyone who might have a medical need for some procedure was getting it, right? That the insurance companies did the exact same thing or were more restrictive in what they would cover. So that, I think that's a challenge in our healthcare system generally, whether we have Affordable Care Act or whether we have the earlier form of kind of private insurance, is that there are always going to be these questions raised about which kinds of procedures and patients are going to be covered.
Before we had the Affordable Care Act, we actually, basically, I think, had healthcare tied to employment. If you were supposed to get a job, and then your company was supposed to pay insurance for it.
Yeah, well, and we still largely do, right?
I know, I'm not saying we don't, yeah. But that's the way healthcare, you know, that was brought into this country in 1942. Before that, it just, healthcare wasn't a big issue. So it's cheap, and it was done accidentally.
One during the Depression.
Somebody in government answered a question, gave 10 minutes to the decision, and said, yeah, this firm can pay health insurance. Because during World War II, they couldn't get anybody to work for them, so one firm said, well, we'll give you health. And that's how it got in there, just by accident. We're the only country in the world that ties healthcare to employment, I think.
Yeah.
Which I think is about the worst way to do it, because now, with all the firms, it costs them a third of their cost will be for, not to pay the worker, but pay healthcare and all the other things. And so they want their workers, they got to work overtime, and then they don't want to hire anybody new, because, you know, they don't have to pay health.
So we have a mess,
But-
right?
Yeah,
So,
we have a
but-
mess.
But wasn't it during the Nixon administration when Humana came in and they hospitalization for profit? And before then, they always had a certain profit margin hospitals had that they had to maintain, like 7%. Then when Humana came in from California, they started saying you can make as much profit as you want off of hospitalization.
so there are, we have a very complicated
Right.
system
And-
with a very,
I don't know if you're trying to lead us anywhere with this, but I don't understand why Cuba can produce all these doctors and they charge, of course, they're control of what they can charge.
Mhm.
But we as America, in a capitalist society, can't produce as many doctors as Cuba does. I mean, they have so many they have to export them to other countries.
There's two words for that, tort and lawyers.
Well,
well, I mean, so look, how would, I mean, obviously we're not gonna solve the healthcare issues in America this morning. So where do we, how do we come at this, right? So to go back to our principles, right? I mean, obviously we have to start with this idea of human dignity, right? Which is going to mean that we are never going to approve of kind of an intentional harming of an innocent person, right? So abortion and euthanasia ought to be opposed, right? Because those are never going to be moral, obviously from a Catholic perspective, but just anyone should be able to recognize, we would say, if they're reasoning properly, that these things ought not to happen. And similarly, things like contraception or embryonic stem cell research, a lot of these other things which are, in some cases, maybe subtler issues, but still we would say that they do kind of violate that dignity, that we're changing the way God made us, right, and that we ought not to be doing that. So we've got that principle on the one hand, right? We also have these principles of recognizing the human dignity of the poor, of people who don't have access to health care, right? And that we are called to have solidarity with them, we're called to support the common good and the community. So we ought to be working to provide health care to everybody, right? And the church would say that health care, based on our principles, health care is not a consumer good, it's a right? That it's something, everyone should have access to health care based on our belief in the intrinsic dignity of every person.
Could we say that it's the same as elementary education? Every person in the United States is entitled to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could argue maybe even it's a more fundamental, right? That preserving the person's life is kind of on a very, very basic level in terms of recognizing dignity. So, right, to really, there's all these complicated issues about how we got in the mess we are in, but a lot of the debate in Catholic circles has focused on the seeming tension between these two things we've just talked about, right? Because the Affordable Care Act, on the one hand, promotes access to procedures that we would see as intrinsically immoral. On the other hand, it promotes access to health care for people which we would see as an essentially good thing. So how on earth are we supposed to move forward on this?
Has to go with the greater good, I think.
That's going to be part of it, right? But the important thing to make sure we don't fall into, right, is we can't become just utilitarian in our reasoning, right? Because a lot of people, when they argue for, well, let's pick the choice that's going to produce the greatest good, you have to do that in a way that doesn't directly intend immoral actions, right? So what I would say is, what we can do is use this principle double effect and that other principle we talked about long time ago. We talked about the principle of legitimate cooperation, right? So there's the principle of legitimate cooperation, the principle of double effect, right? Both of which could be brought into this discussion about healthcare, right? So principle of double effect, and this is where one of the things we have to think about is what's going to be the balance of good and bad effects. But we can't just jump to that, because if we just go directly to that, that's utilitarianism, right? We first have to say, is the action itself moral or immoral, right? Because if the action is intrinsically immoral, we can't do it, right? So if some scientist could convince us that, look, if I could manipulate this one embryo, I can cure cancer. Wow, right? I mean, I think most people in the country would say yes, right? Do that. As Catholics, we ought to say no, right? That you can't intentionally do something immoral, destroying this one embryo, even if it is going to produce this huge good, right? So when the scientists stand up and say, oh, we could cure Parkinson's, we could cure Alzheimer's, first of all, that's almost certainly false. They've been doing this for decades now. They haven't cured anything with embryonic stem cell research. They have cured a number of things with moral adult stem cell research, so we ought to be focusing on what actually works and what is actually moral. So, right, I mean, again, the healthcare bill in and of itself is not intrinsically immoral, right? It's this big complicated thing. So then the question is, if we've got these two effects, how do we go from here? Right? We could say we have to intend the good, right? So when you are making your choice as a voter or as a constituent or somebody buying insurance, your intention has to be for the good outcome, right? So if you are going to support the Affordable Care Act, you have to be supporting it because it provides access to health care, not because it provides increased access to abortion or contraception or something else that would be immoral, right? So you have to intend the good. You can't get the good effect through the bad effect, right? So if you're gonna increase access to healthcare by eliminating all of the people who are expensive, right, you can't do that, right? So there's this British comedy sketch online. They do a bunch of satirical videos, and one of them's these politicians are what if we killed the poor, right? And it's just just think of all the problems we could solve if we what if we killed the poor? Right? You can't kill the poor to solve your problems. So you can't use the immoral or the bad effect in order to get the good effect. Now again, that people debate, it doesn't seem to be the case here, right? So then the question you get to is, does the good effect outweigh the bad, right? And this is where there's a lot of debate. Does the increased access to health care balance, or is at least proportionate to the bad effect of increased access to abortion or contraception or what have you? Now again, I don't think we're going to solve this morning.
Has there been more access to health care for people?
Yeah, so there are certainly more people covered who have health insurance coverage than there were prior to this. The other interesting thing, if you look at the statistics, the number of abortions has increased or decreased, that's a key misstatement. The number of abortions in the country has decreased pretty substantially since 2010, which I think is the year for when this was.
Because of the access to healthcare.
Well, I mean, again, people debate the causality, but there have been some studies that show women are less likely to choose abortion if they have access to health care. Now, again, people obviously debate this. The U.S. bishops, if you go to their page, basically their position is that using principle double effect, it can be moral to support the continuation of the Affordable Care Act. And the Kansas bishops put out a letter a few years back advocating expansion of Medicaid, basically in line with this. Now, there's this other principle, if you remember, the principle of legitimate cooperation. Right, so this is the principle that you use when you are involved in some sort of social system where there's an immoral action going on. Right, so to jog your memories, I think we talked about what if you work at a hospital where abortions are performed. If you're the nurse handing the doctor the scalpel, right, you can't do that, even if you personally object, right? That's immediate material cooperation, it's immoral. If you're the technician who sets up the surgical rooms where they perform abortions, right, you can't do that. That would be immediate material cooperation. Now, can you be in accounting? Can you be a janitor? Can you, right? So there might be situations where you are removed, where you have a remote participation, right? And then it can be moral, but the key is to try to limit and eliminate that involvement as much as possible, right? So in some cases this is going to mean you're going to advocate, right? So like as taxpayers we were talking about, for most of us, not participating as taxpayers is not an option, right? Because they get upset if you do that. So what you need to do as best you can is to advocate for change in the government that you are supporting through your tax dollars. Now sometimes if it's remote cooperation, if I'm shopping at this store and they're doing something immoral and that store isn't, and if I can go to that store, it's better to go to that store, right? To not be involved. So there's all kinds of situations. So basically, you can be involved in a social system where there's an immoral action happening and not have it be you are committing an immoral act yourself. But that doesn't let you off the hook, right? You have to still try to eliminate your involvement or end the immoral action, right? So if you look at what the U.S. bishops will say and what the Kansas bishops have said, is that they support the increased access to health care. What they want is to continue and improve that, but reform the Affordable Care Act to eliminate the immoral aspects, right? The parts where it is providing increased coverage for access to abortion, birth control, right? So, I mean, it is, now again, I think there are Catholics who, in good conscience, would argue that that fourth criteria doesn't work out that way, that the bad effect of increased coverage for like contraception or other things is too great. I think the bishops as a group and the Kansas bishops have argued that it seems to have had a pretty significant increase in terms of access to health care, and the number of abortions at least seems to have decreased. So they would say they feel that the support but reform approach fits these principles. But again, this is one of those places where we have to think about prudentially how to apply these principles to complex situations. So there still are going to be debates in Catholic circles about that.
What do you think about manipulation of the DNA?
I'm sorry, about?
Manipulation of the DNA.
Oh, that's a whole complicated. So she was asking about like genetic engineering and things like this, right? So it's complicated, which is what I tell my daughter for like every question she asks me. She's like, well, Dad, what about this? I'm like, it's complicated. So genetic engineering is not intrinsically immoral, right? There could be moral ways of using it.
To prevent the disease that comes in the family.
Yeah, right. So look, if we could get, right, so one of the real challenges is prudence, right? That we don't know as much as we think we do about the way things work. And it's like 15 years ago even, people thought, oh, well, there's a gene for this and a gene, we'll just go in and change the gene that changes noses, and we can get rid of like this ugly nose. Well, it turns out most genes aren't just the ugly nose gene. Most of them are also affected in lots of other systems. So if you change the ugly nose gene, it could mess up things that you don't understand. So one thing most scientists, most responsible scientists, even secular scientists, like the CRISPR stuff where you can do this, there's a big push even among secular scientists to say we should not be doing this with human beings until we are much further along in understanding how it works. So we have that. Now look, if theoretically we could get to a point where we could be pretty confident that we could go in, find an embryo very early in its development and genetically fix cleft palates or a genetic predisposition to cystic fibrosis, right? So there would be nothing intrinsically immoral about that, right? So if you could do that and could be prudently judging the potential outcomes of your action, you could do that. But we're not there scientifically.
It just sort of hit me that healthcare is like tied to the environment. I mean, addiction, I mean, all of it. If you don't have access to healthcare and you live in a crappy environment, or you're addicted to drugs or alcohol, or you got mental illness, without the access to healthcare, you're screwed.
Well, and a lot of, right, again, on all these different issues, this is why there's that preferential option for the poor. It tends to be the same groups of people who are on the bottom end of all these issues, right?
But we all started out families young. If you have a child, you've got to really be your middle class. You're basically poor because of the fact that wages are not very high and they haven't been for a long time. Back when I had kids, healthcare, unless you worked, was pretty much inaccessible. And then if you're unfortunate where you have a handicapped kid, then your health insurance goes through the roof. And most of the time back then, they wouldn't cover it.
Yeah.
As opposed now, if you've got a handicapped kid, they will cover it.
Yeah.
So I mean, to me, that's one benefit of it, which is part of the more good than bad.
Well, and that's why that's a lot of the reasoning why the bishops would say, well, we have strong opposition to aspects of it, they would support it for those kinds of reasons. I mean, and there are complicated issues in healthcare, right? I mean, if you look at America's system, we spend about the most of any country in the world per capita.
18%.
And we have some of the lowest
Good outcomes.
outcomes,
Yeah.
right? And so we're spending a whole bunch and we're not getting a lot out of it. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, the messy system. I mean, from a Catholic perspective, I think a lot of it has to do too with we don't have a proper approach to dying, right? And in Catholic tradition, there's something as a good death, right? That you can, in fact, that the suffering and end of life, the dying process, is not something that we have to fight tooth and nail to the bitter end in every case, right? And that you can, in fact, have a good death where you are treated appropriately, but also where you are kind of accepting that you're at the end of life and you make peace with family and friends in the church. And so if you look at the percentage of healthcare spending, a huge percentage of it is spent on the last week of life. And the benefits that we get from that are in many cases really insignificant. Now again, you have to be very careful because you don't want to endorse euthanasia, right? But we could, especially as Catholics, I think, move much more back to a traditional sense of you can have a good death.
But isn't it different though when let's say you have two people, one who has the money to be able to do the treatments and has tried and maybe prolonged his life a little bit, and maybe they have a family, and then eventually they say, I'm sorry, there's nothing more that we can do for you, so then you accept that you are going to die. Versus someone who doesn't have access to health care, who's not given the option of a treatment, there's nothing that can be done, so they have to make that decision to just let themselves go and accept. But that's the money issue. That's
Yeah.
like, that, to me, that seems like it's immoral. If you're given, everybody should be able to have the option, we're all going to be able to accept death when it comes, but I think that it's unfair for those who don't have access, who are young, to have to die because they don't have that option.
Yes, I mean, I don't think anybody would argue, well, I think the Catholic position would be, yes, people ought to have access to treatments that have a real chance of benefiting them, right? A lot of the money, and again, this isn't just Catholics who say that, a lot of just secular doctors say a lot of our money spent in end-of-life care is not that kind of situation. It's where there is no realistic chance of improvement.
Like life support.
But people are just unwilling to have this idea of mortality and of a good death, right? Which is also tied into our country's spiritual problems. But it's striking too if you read doctors, like a lot of oncologists refuse chemotherapy, right, at the end of life because they know, right? And again, I organized this conference last fall, and it was striking listening to some of the doctors talk about, even in a lot of cases, it's not people who choose to forego the kind of radical treatments at the end of life, in a lot of cases live longer, right? Because they are, a lot of those really radical, invasive kinds of treatments have lots of side effects, right? Can actually lead you to have a shorter and poorer quality of life than if you than you would if you just treated symptoms as well as you could.
Think of all the money the hospitals would lose if you did that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, again, that ties into why we as a country spend so much and yet seem to have not terribly good outcomes as a result. So I mean, there's a whole lot of issues tied to that.
What percentage of money do you think we spend on healthcare in the last year of a person's life?
I don't remember the statistics, but it's a huge percentage.
There's a
Percentage.
There's a debate about,
Well, at least the statistics I saw in that conference and in setting it up, it was a pretty large percentage at the end of life.
what about the percentage that's spent on administrative costs and legal costs in healthcare as opposed to end of life?
Yeah, again, those are, I mean, there's lots of interconnected.
Yeah.
So this is not to say whether people could accept the idea of a good traditional death, that this would solve all of our problems. I do think it could be a piece of giving a lot of people better quality of life at the end of life, but that's another issue.
How do you assign percentage of culpability, or do you, for, like you give the example of the assistant who's handled it, and so the
Yeah.
doctor, the abortion tools. I mean, you don't go far back as the Supreme Court 63 decision. You do it right there at the spot when the actual sin is being committed.
I mean, again, these are just principles for the way to think through situations. There's no formula. So, I mean, it can be used for anybody who is involved in any way, right? So the Supreme Court who made the ruling that allowed these things, obviously they are in a way part of the system. Or as a taxpayer, you're paying into the healthcare system, you are in a way involved in it. So there's lots of ways of thinking about our cooperation in these systems, right? Which is part of why all of these issues are so difficult to deal with, is because, you know, what has caused all of these problems we have in healthcare, right? I mean, it's if we started connecting all the dots, it would just be this huge network that would be immense. So, like, how much responsibility does each person have is really difficult to determine, right? What we're called to do is to not be directly involved in something immoral, and then as best we can to eliminate our involvement at all, or to advocate for change if we're part of one of these systems.
So it's your conscience, if you have a politician who favors abortion, but all those other policies favor the human common good, it's gonna be your conscious decision for voting?
I mean, there are all kinds of complicated scenarios you come up with. So if you read, if you look at voting guides, Catholic voting guides, they differ, right? So Priests for Life or EWTN, their voting guides say, here's a checklist of issues. You can never vote for a politician who supports one of these issues, right? Regardless of anything else. If you look at the USCCB's voting guide, they would say their list of intrinsic evil issues is a little different than the other two. And they would say not all issues are equal, right? So that some issues are more important than others. But they don't say you could never vote for a politician who opposes church teaching on one of the issues on the EWTN list. So again, that's a place where I think Catholics with acting in good faith on the same principles can reach different conclusions, right? So some people would say if a office is directly connected to some other issue, this guy's only going to be working on, you know, immigration policy, and the fact that he is pro-choice, he still might be the best choice for the office. Other Catholics would say, well, the fact that he's pro-choice should disqualify him because maybe he's going to move on to a bigger office someday where he's going to have control over abortion issues, right? And I think if you look at the voting guides, there's different ones, there's different approaches to that. And I think that would be where, if you're thinking through these principles, sometimes there's disagreement about particular cases like that.
What you think of the congressman from Alabama that was talking about he favored abortion because you either throw them away now or throw them away later?
I mean,
He wasn't a congressman, he was state rep.
State representative.
yeah, that's
Just Catholic, by the way.
that's formal cooperation
Yeah.
with evil. So and if you intentionally support the immoral thing being done, then yeah, I mean that's clearly.
I was just at awe at it. I mean, who would make a statement like that?
Yeah. So I think
New York City in pink could celebrate that law too.
Yeah.
Who would do that? And they did.
He was a Catholic governor.
Yep.
That's good, that's what. How about the person being resuscitated against the person's will? When it's written in the will, do not, please don't resuscitate, and they go ahead and resuscitate that person.
well, that would, you ought not to do that. And so she's saying, what if a person has a DNR, a do not resuscitate order, and
They
they
go ahead and
resuscitate them? Basically speaking, you ought not to, right? Because part of Catholic healthcare ethics is recognizing patients' autonomy, right? That they have the right to make decisions about their own care. Now, sometimes a DNR is not moral, right? So some people ought not to have
Should
a
somebody be
DNR.
punished for that?
it's complicated.
Because the individual suffered a lot.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we ought to make it so that people aren't kind of heroically resuscitated if that is not going to actually be beneficial for them in terms of the overall good of their life. The complication is, in our healthcare and legal system, there are situations where healthcare providers find themselves in a position where they may not have immediate access to that order, or there may be confusion about whether or not the patient or durable power of attorney for healthcare person rescinded that order. And in those cases, they tend to err on the side of intervening. So that is a challenge, right?
So now to the point.
It's going to depend. If they know that the patient chose this in full competency, then they ought to recognize it, and if they don't, there should be consequences.
The legal blanket for that is hospice.
Yeah, I mean, the
And
problem
then-
is,
Then you don't need a DNR.
it's not always that clear, right, in a lot of these situations. So if EMTs come to a house and find somebody who's unresponsive, unless they have very clear ways of indicating either a bracelet, or apparently you're supposed to stick them on top of your refrigerator. I guess this is where the EMTs look. It is if they don't have clear indications that they're not supposed to resuscitate, they're going to.
Well, they register all hospice orders now online
Yeah.
with the state police, so they're supposed to know.
So again, if you're interested in these, so it turns out, I think maybe as part of the ACA,
Part of the
but maybe
ACA.
not, you can actually, your doctor can get reimbursed, at least from Medicare, for talking about all of these issues with you and setting up a plan. And so the Catholic Church supports setting up moral advance directives, right? So that you should learn what the church teaches about these things, talk to your pastor, talk to a good Catholic chaplain at one of the hospitals, and think about these things and set them up.
What I like about the ACA is it encouraged at least yearly physicals, and it encouraged lifestyle changes. And to me, that was a step towards long-term euthanasia. In my book, if somebody is doing bad things in their life, like they're too fat, or they drink too much, or they smoke, or they don't exercise, I was told a long time ago, if you don't take care of yourself, that's like a moral sin to begin with. So now we got access to health care, which helps us maybe have a better quality of life, if not longer.
Yeah. Although, I do a whole course on food ethics, so I just have to say, yeah.
No,
But yes, we have a moral obligation to be good stewards of the bodies and life God gave us. It's not as simple though as like individual willpower, right? So there are companies that specifically know that their products are bad for people, and yet do everything they can to maximize consumption of those products. So it is, and the people who are least able to resist those things tend to be the poor, the marginalized. Right? I lived in New York City for 4 or 5 years, and it is striking when you move from the really nice part of Brooklyn we lived in at the end, where we were the poorest people, easily. Everybody is like, they look like they stepped off the pages of like Women's Health magazine, or Cosmo, right? Everybody's thin, everybody's, So, but I went to school in the Bronx, right, where Fordham is. And so you get off the subway in the Bronx, it's the exact opposite, right? Everybody looks like the before photos in a weight loss video, or right, the people you're like, we watched a video about food with my kids the other day, and they're like, you never want to be like, you never want to watch one of those and be like, wait, that's my backside, right? Where they show the picture of the people. But in the Bronx, people are much, I don't think that's because all the people in Park Slope, Brooklyn were more moral people than the people in the Bronx. I think the people in the Bronx didn't have access to good food, didn't have access to gyms, didn't have, they were working multiple part-time jobs and didn't have time to cook and to exercise, the people in Brooklyn could. So yeah, again, that would be one of these big complicated Catholic social justice issues. All right. Well, I'm glad we sorted out all the problems in America and in healthcare.
And international.
Yeah, sure. Sure. We never got back to Venezuela, I'm sorry. I have the answer to it in my head, but I may not be able to give it to you before I leave. So thank you all.
Thank you.